The steps he took will define our reality.
There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Good morning. Good morning. It never gets less dramatic, that video. Breaking news. There is a new government in charge, a new king, a new ruler. I don't know if you can remember, it feels like a lifetime ago now, but back in 2016, on June the 24th, we woke up to the results of the Brexit referendum, the referendum on the EU. And I don't know about you, but that day is vivid in my memory as being a day where it felt like the world had changed. Whether you voted to remain or to leave, the day felt like something momentous had occurred. There was going to be a new regime, a new order of things. But I don't know if you've also noticed, like new governments come and go, and changes to policies come and go, and some cause us anxiety, some don't. But none of them make any real difference to us until they do make a difference to us. You know, I'm not too worried about the rule and reign of gravity until I get onto a plane, and then I hope that the laws of physics don't change. Or many of us don't really mind which government's in charge until we have a problem accessing healthcare, or we need help getting a job, and then the government's decisions concern us. None of us were really too fussed about Sweden until the lockdown, and then we all started to wish we had a slightly more Swedish government than an English one, certainly with the approach that was being taken. Well, we are today considering and engaging with a vivid and dramatic occasion in the Gospels, a much-loved account of a woman caught in an act of adultery, being thrown at the feet of Jesus and being presented to him, and him being given the power to free her or to kill her, to slay her or to save her. And this woman perhaps can identify, as many of us can, with that idea that I don't really mind which government's in charge until it affects me. This woman no doubt had heard things about Jesus. Maybe you've heard things about Jesus. We're aware of Jesus. But who Jesus is doesn't really make much difference to our lives until it really does. This woman suddenly found herself before Jesus' feet, and she needed to know this man who claims to be, and people were saying was, a new king. It didn't really matter what he was like until now, because now my life is in his hands. Many people feel like that about Christianity and about God, about the bigger questions in life. We'll push them to the back of our minds. We won't answer them until perhaps something like a pandemic has caused us all to be aware a lot more of our own mortality. And so it matters more than ever before if there's something after death, if there is a purpose that we're supposed to be living for, if there's a God and what he's like. Those two experiences, the Brexit experience and the experience that we've all been through of the pandemic, waking up on that first morning after the announcement that we needed to stay home. Those two experiences point us to different types of government or powers in the world. There are the human powers, kings and governments that come and go, and then there are perhaps the unseen forces, the principles in the world that just are stubborn as gravity. They don't change. They exist permanently. Those are two different types of rule in the world. Popular in Jesus' day was the philosophy of the Stoics. If you ever heard someone talking about behaving stoically, they're referring to a philosophy known as Stoicism. And Stoicism held that there was this natural law, this principle by which the universe operated, and some governments were good if they lined up with that universal principle. Some governments were bad if they kicked against that universal principle. But there are those two concepts of government in the world, human and divine, constantly changing, always remaining the same. Human beings may vary in their approach to rule and reign. Some are good, some are bad. But the universal principles of the government, of the Stoics believed in the natural law, that didn't change. Well, the breaking news of John's Gospel is that principle, what the Stoics referred to as the logos in the universe, that principle has become a human being. In John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, the logos became flesh and blood. That in Jesus, John's claim is that these two powers of government have come together in this one man. He is a human being, but he's also a universal principle. He is the Logos of God. There's a new king, and his rule is absolute and unbending and unchanging. And to him, everybody must bow, just as everybody must succumb to the natural law of the Logos in the universe. So the question then, to people who are following John's gospel, the question then to people who are hearing Jesus' claim to divinity and kingship, the question is, what kind of a king is he? How will he rule, this logos become flesh? Will he be wise like Solomon? Will he be remote like Caesar? Will he be jealous like Herod? What kind of king will he be? Well, the answer that John gives us is in the second half. Says that this logos who's become flesh, this ultimate ruler, is full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. And perhaps the way Jesus deals with this woman caught in the act of adultery is for John and for us a fleshed out, vivid illustration of what it means then for this king to be full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. I have a friend who talks about the importance of responding to challenging ethical issues and changing circumstances, responding to them with a heart response, a head response, and a hope response. A heart response, a head response, a hope response. We respond to the suffering, we respond to the truth, and we respond with the gospel. That's what it means to respond with being full of grace and truth. I don't know if you saw it in the news this week, but Seaford has made headlines nationally. Seaford Head School, the secondary school here, has changed the name of its houses that the students are put in, changed them from popular figures to being natural landmarks. But part of the reason it's done that, and the reason it reached the headlines, was because two of the house names that they've changed because of ethical reasons. Winston Churchill and J.K. Rowling are no longer house names for Seaford Head School. Churchill because he was racist and had some racist views, and J.K. Rowling because of some things that she said that have offended the trans community. The school has responded, the pupils of the school have responded overwhelmingly with a heart response to suffering. Racism is always evil, and it's not enough to just not be racist. Instead, we must be anti-racist. So the school have responded. Winston Churchill, therefore, cannot be an esteemed, honorary person that we held up in our school. Similarly, the suffering experienced by people who experience gender dysphoria, the suffering of persons who feel uncomfortable in their body. We need to respond with a heart response to people's suffering. And so they've done that. They've seen someone in J.K. Rowling who's made some comments that have offended that community and have devalued those persons' experience. And they've responded full of heart. Equally, Brighton midwives have made national news this week as well, as I was talking to one of those midwives in the last few minutes before the service started about. They have recommended policies to adopt more inclusive language that no longer refers to just breastfeeding, but also chest feeding, in a desire to acknowledge the suffering of people in the trans community. They are doing what they can to respond in a gracious, kind, and loving way to people's suffering. Heart response, head response, and hope response. Whenever we hear stories like that, each of us have instinctive reactions. What's your instinctive reaction? Is it to react with a heart response to someone's suffering, to this woman who's presented before Jesus? Our hearts go out to her instantly. Her life hangs by a thread. Or is our instinct to respond with our head, or we might say respond full of truth instead of being full of grace? and to confront what we see as being wrong, something that we see as being wrong, something we disagree with. Christians and people in religious communities like ours, unfortunately, have a reputation for leading with a head response, leading with a truth response that feels the need to call things that deviate back into line as quickly as we can. And though, as we'll see, truth matters and responding with our head matters, Jesus' response, first of all, is the response of the heart that cares for this woman. This, after all, the man before this woman is the Logos, the eternal, unbending principle in the universe, God incarnate. And that being cannot be bargained with. Truth cannot be changed. We cannot set aside gravity for just one moment and hope that the universe and the world holds together. This woman before Jesus has done wrong, after all, and she knows it. She knows she's unlikely to survive this encounter. And the last thing this woman did before her death was sin. Surely for a woman like this, heaven is likely to be shut up tight. Now, even in a progressive society like ours, we recognize that what she's done is wrong. She has broken a sacred bond between two people. She has torn a family apart. She has endangered the fragile social order of her community. She's guilty. She's a sinner. She's like us. And I think it's relevant as well that this woman has been caught not stealing or doing anything else, but she's been caught in an act of sexual indiscretion. Because acts of sexual indiscretion are something that we can all relate to and identify with. In the Old Testament, one of the 10 Commandments is, you shall not commit adultery. And that command, it's widely understood, is a summary command for all of the Bible's teaching on sex and sexuality. The Bible's teaching essentially is that the place of sex is between one man and one woman in a marriage relationship where there's a covenant of community and strength, and to preserve the marriage bond and to create communities and to bring stability to families. But Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, he says that anyone who even looks at another person lustfully or with lustful intent has already committed adultery in their heart. We are, all of us, guilty of breaking those commands. All of us are like this woman. And so what is Jesus going to do? Since he is the Logos, since he is the God incarnate, since he is truth made flesh, how will he respond? And this is an important question, because in answering the question how Jesus responds to this woman, we're not just asking how did a wise, kind human teacher treat a woman caught in sin. We're actually asking how does the eternal God feel about our sin? How does he respond to our sexual indiscretion? What is God like in eternity? And that's why I want us to flick over, if you have a Bible open. Do you remember paper Bibles before our digital age? If you have a Bible open, flick over to the end part of our Bible reading that we had read to us. In verse 59, Jesus is defending his identity before the religious leaders. And in his reply to them, it says, and so they picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. In Jesus' response to these religious leaders in a discussion about his identity, they became so offended by what he said that they were ready to kill him. Many people are content to believe that Jesus is a wise and good moral teacher, a wise man. Some even go so far as to say that he never intended to start a religious movement. Our Muslim friends tell us that Jesus never once claimed to be God, and that Christians later deified him and made him out to be God, something that he would never have wanted, and that is an outrage and an act of blasphemy. Blasphemy. That's what Jesus is being accused of here. That's why they've picked up stones to kill him, because they understand that he, a mere man, has claimed to be more than that, has claimed to be God. Our reading begins with the bloodlust of some leaders wanting to stone a sinner caught in an act of sin. And it ends with those same stones perhaps now being aimed at Jesus. In the discussion that Jesus has with these people, they talk about Abraham, and he claims to have been with Abraham and spoken to Abraham. He lived almost 2,000 years before Jesus. And so when Jesus says, before Abraham was born, Jesus is making a claim that he is over 2,000 years old. So far, though, just claiming to be 2,000 years old is not a reason to be killed. After all, deranged people have said strange things in every society. They pick up rocks to kill him because of the two words that he spoke after claiming to be older than 2,000 years old. You see, in 1300 BC, a goat herder named Moses was out tending his flock when the glory of God appeared in the form of a fire, consuming but never burning a bush that burned endlessly. In that moment, Moses was commissioned by God to confront the global superpower of his day and to seek an audience with Pharaoh. His demands were that Pharaoh should release his people who were being held as slaves. Moses, a mere goat herder and a fugitive from Egypt, was understandably alarmed by this, and so said to God in his glory in the burning bush, he said, "Who shall I say has sent me?" The reply is, "Tell them, I am has sent you. I am the eternal being who needs no justification. I am that I am," God says. That's all you need to say. Those two words, I am, then became sacred and holy, identified as being God's eternal nature revealed to human beings. And so when Jesus says to them, "Very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am," he claims to be God. And so we cannot patronize Jesus and say, "You are just a wise teacher. I like the things you have to say." We cannot just be impressed with his wisdom or his compassion before the woman caught in an act of adultery and not reckon with this statement. Neither can we say that Jesus never claimed to be God, since he most categorically did. And so let's gather that together and bring it together and place it alongside this woman who's been caught as she has. She's before a man who claims to be the eternal God of heaven. And so how he behaves next will give us authoritative truth about how God relates to people caught doing wrong, how God relates to you and me. His first response, as we've said, is the response of the heart. He sees a victim. He sees a woman who has been humiliated by powerful men, who's become a pawn in their game. They don't really care about her, or justice for that matter. All they really want is to trick Jesus. It's true that in the Old Testament, the law did command stonings under certain circumstances for both people caught committing adultery. And that's the scandal here. You don't commit adultery alone. This woman was caught, we're told, in an act of adultery, and yet there is only one person before Jesus. Jesus sees this woman. A woman who, if we're honest, I think we can all relate to, regardless of whether we have committed this particular sin. This woman is alone and isolated and vulnerable. Darkness is closing in on her. For many of us, that's been our experience of the last few weeks under lockdown, in the darkest depths and throes of winter, alone, isolated, in an endless cycle of feeling as though the world is closing in on us. Jesus' heart response to her sees her for who she is, understands the trick that's been played on her, the trap that she finds herself in. He recognizes the suffering. And Jesus came for sufferers. He came for sinners. Jesus doesn't want to kill this woman. And the crowds know that Jesus doesn't want to kill this woman. That's why they've used this particular trap to try to trap him. But Jesus doesn't just respond with the heart and say, therefore ignore the law. He responds with his head as well. He knows that this is a trap. He thinks it through. In fact, as you read the story, I love the dramatic poise of this woman before Jesus, and Jesus, we're told, bending down to write in the dust. We don't know what he's writing. We're only left to speculate. Is he writing out the Ten Commandments? Is he writing some Old Testament verses that relate to this woman's situation? Or is he stalling for time? You don't get the impression he's stalling for time. You get the impression he sees through the trap that's been laid for him. See, he knows that if he pardons this woman, he'll be seen to have broken Jewish law. Therefore, he's committed a crime. He can't be God. He can't be someone who upholds the law. But they also know if he goes through with this and says, fine, kill her, then he'll break Roman law because the Romans were in charge. And the Romans were the ones who were supposed to deal out death and punishment in the society, not the Jews. That was the circumstances they found themselves in. So he knows the trap. He also knows the truth that this woman is not just a victim, she's also a sinner. She has done wrong. You know, victimhood as an identity may be helpful, but it can run the risk of infantilizing us, causing us to believe that we're all just powerless and helpless. We're just victims. Can't help it. This woman couldn't help it. She could help it. I remember a time a friend of mine says that he was behaving in a fairly childish way and wanted to get the attention of a girl that he fancied. And so he fired an elastic band at her, as one does. But he isn't known for his coordination, and he let go of the wrong end of the elastic band, and it pinged back and got him in the eye, causing him immense amount of pain. What happened next was that the girl that he was aiming his elastic band at, came over to comfort him and to tend to him and to nurse his wounds. My friend was a fool. He behaved ridiculously, but he was treated with compassion and kindness. He wasn't a victim of an elastic band in the eye, but of his own stupidity. We cannot set aside truth because things are hard, because the truth is unpopular. Instead, we must acknowledge the pain and suffering of people. But having acknowledged the pain and suffering of people, we must respond, because we cannot set aside reality and truth. We must uphold the natural law. We must respond with truth. Jesus offers the crowd what they want, a chance to kill the woman and to deal out justice. He responds full of grace, but full of truth. Jesus is a person who's full of both. He's not 50% truth and 50% grace. Jesus is 100% truth and 100% grace. He's a 200% reality. And Jesus, in the way that he treats this woman after they've all dropped their stones and walked away, he speaks to her and says, "Neither do I condemn you." He doesn't say, "Your sin never mattered." Or he doesn't say, "We're redefining the rules on sin and sexuality." He simply says, "Neither do I condemn you." And in dealing in this way, he points to the third response, which is the response not just of the heart or of our heads, but of hope. He responds with the gospel. As we mentioned, there are two attempted stonings here, one of the woman and one of Jesus. Jesus, the Logos, pardons this woman because he knows what he came to do. He came to make provision for sinners like her and sufferers like us. He came to offer not just pardon and say, "Don't worry, let's not call it sin, let's rewrite the rule books. I know that person may have been popular once, but let's just ignore everything they've ever done. Let's ignore what they've said. Let's set aside truth and let's only listen to our feelings." Jesus doesn't set aside truth. Instead, he points beyond and responds as one who is eternally full of grace and truth. What kind of a king is Jesus? Well, this woman found out he's full of grace and truth. For what we've seen in that Jesus claiming to be God is that full of grace and truth is not something that Jesus isn't something that was just the mood of Jesus at the time, but is something that God is always. God is eternally full of grace and full of truth. We are called to be, as Christians, those who respond full of grace and full of truth. And with every situation we come across, we need to discern for ourselves, where do we need to respond with our heart? Where do we need to respond with our head? But ultimately, this world is not where it ends. There is a hope response because Jesus bore in himself the punishment for all of our sin, all of our sexual indiscretion and guilt, all of our suffering, all of our isolation and depression and loneliness. Jesus identified with it all. And as he spoke to this woman tenderly and with compassion, he knew that day was coming. He knew that the religious leaders on this occasion, although they missed with their stones, although he dodged their stones, he knew there was coming a day where it wouldn't be stones that they'd throw at him, but they'd drive nails through his forearms and through his legs. And he knows that there is that day where he will offer hope, forgiveness, truth, love, and grace to the entire world, not by saying your sin doesn't matter, but by saying, I'll bear the punishment of your sin. Now go and live a different life. Learn to follow me. That's who Jesus is. That's the kind of king he is. That's why it matters. That's why this is breaking news. There's a new government, a new ruler, a new king that all of us are subject to. And rather than that causing us anxiety about the world that we're making together, rather than us being intimidated and terrified about the unmoving, unbending law of the Logos that rules everything, the natural law that doesn't change, instead we know that this king is one who's full of grace and full of truth. Let's pray.